What if a single decision could set the entire world on fire? What if silence meant surrender and courage the only way to survive? Between 1939 and 1945, humanity witnessed its darkest hour and its most heroic defiance. A war not fought in one land, but in every ocean, across deserts, forests, skies, and cities turned to rubble. This wasn't just a conflict of armies. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle for survival, and a war that reshaped our world forever. From a rise of Hitler and the devastation of Pearl Harbor to the ashes of Hiroshima and the liberation of Auschwitz, this is not just history. This is a warning, a lesson, and a legacy. In this documentary, we take you deep into the trenches of World War II, unveiling forgotten stories, unseen truths, and the raw human spirit behind the statistics. Whether you're a history lover, a curious mind, or someone who seeks to understand how the world came to be, this is your Frontline. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe now to History Vault, and hit the bell icon to never miss a revelation from the past that still echoes today. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what could happen again. It was a silence that felt unnatural, the kind that lingers before a storm. The world in 1939 stood at the edge of something vast and terrifying, yet few could imagine just how deep the abyss would go. From the ruins of World War I, Europe had tried to rebuild itself, to find peace in treaties and hope in broken alliances. But beneath the surface, tensions festered, wounds never truly healed. Nationalism surged, economies faltered, and men who promised order through iron rule rose to power. Among them, one figure stood darker than most: Adolf Hitler, Chancellor of Germany, whose vision of a greater Reich would plunge the world into the most devastating conflict in human history. It began not with a loud explosion, but with an invasion. On September 1st, 1939, the German Wehrmacht stormed into Poland with a force unlike anything Europe had seen before. Columns of tanks crushed resistance while the Luftwaffe roared overhead, turning cities to rubble. It was a new kind of warfare, fast, brutal, relentless, soon be known as Blitzkrieg. Within weeks, Poland was carved up between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, as per their secret non-aggression pact. The world stood stunned. Britain and France declared war in response, but their armies remained largely idle, hesitant, and unsure, waiting behind the fences of the Maginot Line. The months that followed became known as the Phony War. Europe was technically at war, but the front lines remained eerily quiet. Meanwhile, Hitler moved with strategy and speed. In April 1940, he invaded Denmark and Norway to secure shipping routes and vital resources. Then in May, the storm broke in full. Germany launched a lightning-fast invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, pushing quickly toward France. The French army, though once proud, was unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the attack. German panzer divisions bypassed the fortified Maginot Line, sweeping through the Ardennes forest where the French believed no army could pass. In just 6 weeks, France fell. The once mighty French government fled. Paris was occupied, and the Nazi flag flew over Western Europe. Britain now stood alone. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler believed that the British would soon beg for peace, but he was wrong. Instead, Britain dug in, refusing surrender. And in the skies above London, a new battle began, one fought by young pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes, who rose to meet the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. The air war raged through the summer and autumn of 1940. Cities burned, civilians took shelter in underground tunnels, and children were evacuated to the countryside. But Britain endured. Winston Churchill, the new prime minister, gave voice to defiance with words that echoed through time. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender." The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, held the skies. Hitler blinked first. His dream of conquering Britain crumbled in the clouds, and for the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. But Hitler was not finished. Even as Britain remained defiant, he turned eastward, toward an even more ambitious and catastrophic goal: the conquest of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, would become the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German troops surged across the border, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Stalin was caught off guard. Entire Soviet divisions collapsed in the face of the Blitz. Cities like Kiev, Smolensk, and Minsk fell, but the Soviet Union was vast, and its people resilient. As winter approached, the German advance stalled. The Red Army, battered and bleeding, refused to die. In Moscow, reinforcements from Siberia arrived just in time, driving back the freezing and exhausted German troops. Hitler had underestimated the Soviet will and the Russian winter, just as Napoleon had a century before. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, another storm was brewing, one that would drag the United States into the global conflict. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Explosions shattered the calm morning as ships burned and aircraft were destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans died in the attack. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared it a date which will live in infamy. America had tried to stay neutral, but now there was no turning back. The sleeping giant had awakened. With the United States in the war, the conflict took on truly global dimensions. Battles erupted across North Africa, Southeast Asia, the Atlantic Ocean, and deep into the heart of Europe. Soldiers from every corner of the world were drawn into the vortex. Americans, Soviets, Chinese, British, Canadians, Australians, Indians, and many others. The war was no longer just a European crisis. It was World War II. As 1941 ended, the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, seemed to dominate. Their armies held vast territories from Norway to North Africa, from the deserts of Libya to the jungles of the Philippines. But under the surface, their triumphs were beginning to crack. Resistance movements formed in occupied countries. Partisans fought from forests, cities, and mountains. And in Washington, London, and Moscow, the Allies began to coordinate, to plan, and prepare for the long and bloody road ahead. The world was no longer what it had been. Millions had already perished. Cities were in ruins, and an entire generation faced a future shaped by war. The conflict had become not just a fight between nations, but a battle of ideologies. Fascism versus freedom, tyranny versus democracy. What began as a lightning war had turned into a grinding, global struggle for the very soul of humanity. And though the darkness had spread far, a light still flickered in the hearts of those who refused to surrender. The year 1942 marked a turning point in the war. Not because the Axis powers were weakening, but because the world had begun to push back. For years, Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese warlords had marched forward with seemingly unstoppable power. But now, the tide of war was beginning to shift. Slowly, painfully, and with the blood of millions, the Allies started to fight back, 1 inch at a time, in deserts, in jungles, on seas, and in cities reduced to ashes. In North Africa, the sun beat down over endless sands as German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, led his Afrika Korps in a deadly dance of tactics against British and Commonwealth forces. The battles at Tobruk, El Alamein, and across Libya and Egypt were as brutal as any in Europe. Supply lines became lifelines. Tanks raced across dunes. Mines were hidden beneath the sand, and snipers struck from ruined outposts. But Rommel's brilliance was not enough. British General Bernard Montgomery, backed by increasing reinforcements and American supplies, halted the German advance. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Allies struck back decisively. Churchill would later call it the end of the beginning. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, one city became the crucible of the entire Eastern Front. Stalingrad. It was not just a name on a map. It became a symbol of sacrifice and determination. In the summer of 1942, German armies pushed into the city, determined to seize control of the Volga River and break Soviet morale. But Stalin had ordered that not one step be surrendered. What followed was not war in the traditional sense. It was carnage. Entire neighborhoods became battlefields. Soldiers fought room by room, floor by floor, while civilians starved and froze in cellars and ruins. The Volga ran red with blood. And yet, the Soviets held on. Then came the counterattack. Operation Uranus, a massive Soviet pincer movement, encircled the German Sixth Army. Trapped, starving, and out of ammunition, they were ordered by Hitler to hold their ground. No surrender. But the cold did not obey orders, nor did hunger. In February 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Red Army. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. Only a fraction would survive the camps. Stalingrad was more than a Soviet victory. It was a crack in the Nazi war machine, the first real sign that Hitler could be beaten. In the Pacific, the United States was fighting a very different kind of war. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with brutal speed. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, and countless islands fell under the rising sun. Civilians suffered atrocities, massacres, forced labor, starvation. But in June 1942, at a tiny atoll called Midway, the balance shifted. U.S. Navy codebreakers uncovered Japanese plans for an ambush. Forewarned, the American fleet lay in wait. The battle lasted just 3 days, but its impact was colossal. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, vessels that had taken part in the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a blow from which the Imperial Navy would never fully recover. On the ground, the Americans and their allies began a grueling campaign of island hopping. Each island was a fortress, each beach a kill zone. At Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines waded ashore into hell. The jungle was thick, the insects constant, and the enemy fanatical. But the Americans dug in. The Japanese attacked again and again, often at night, screaming through the trees in suicide charges. After 6 months of slaughter, the Allies held the island. It was just the beginning. As the war spread, so did its horrors. In Europe, Nazi Germany's true face was becoming clear. Behind the front lines, a systematic campaign of extermination was underway. Jews, Roma, disabled people, and political dissidents were rounded up and transported in cattle cars to camps with names that would burn into the memory of history: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. The Holocaust was not madness. It was method. Industrialized genocide, orchestrated by bureaucrats and carried out with chilling efficiency. 6 million Jews were murdered, alongside millions of others. Entire communities vanished. Children, women, the elderly, none were spared. The world would not know the full scale until the camps were liberated, but whispers had already begun to reach the West. Inside Germany, not all were silent. Some resisted. The White Rose, a group of students in Munich, distributed leaflets condemning Hitler's regime. They were caught and executed. In July 1944, German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb hidden in a briefcase. The plot failed. The conspirators were tortured and hanged, some with piano wire, filmed as warnings. But these acts of defiance, though crushed, showed the world that even within the heart of darkness, some still dared to resist. In the Atlantic Ocean, the war was also raging. German U-boats prowled the seas like sharks, sinking Allied convoys and starving Britain of supplies. Merchant sailors braved the cold waters, often knowing that a single torpedo could mean death. But slowly, Allied technology improved. Radar, sonar, and code-breaking turned the tide. The wolf packs were hunted down, and by 1943, the Atlantic was no longer Germany's playground. Back in Europe, Mussolini's Italy was beginning to crumble. In 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily, and from there moved into the Italian mainland. The Italian people, weary of war and fascism, rose up. Mussolini was deposed, then rescued by German commandos, only to be captured again. In 1945, he and his mistress were executed by Italian partisans. Their bodies hung in a Milan square. Italy changed sides, joining the Allies, but fierce fighting continued in the mountains against German forces holding the peninsula. By the end of 1943, the world had changed. The Axis powers still held vast territory, but their enemies were closing in. The Soviet Union was pushing westward, reclaiming cities and land. The United States was building a war machine unlike anything seen before. Britain, though battered, was still fighting. And new alliances were forming. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met to plan the future, to envision not just a defeat of Hitler, but the shape of the post-war world. But before peace could come, darker days still lay ahead. The road to Berlin was lined with death. The Pacific still burned. The war was not yet won, and its final chapters would be written in fire and sacrifice. The year was 1944, and the world was holding its breath. The Allies had gathered strength, forged bonds, and fought side by side across continents. Now, they were preparing for a move that would shake the very foundations of Nazi Europe. In the dark silence before dawn on June 6th, over 156,000 Allied troops boarded ships and aircraft for what would become the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Its code name was Operation Overlord, but the world would remember it simply as D-Day. Across the English Channel, the beaches of Normandy waited, fortified, mined, and watched by German eyes. Hitler believed the main invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. It was a mistake. As the first waves of troops landed at dawn, the skies erupted. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines under cover of night. Battleships opened fire, pounding the shore. Landing crafts hit the beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Men ran headfirst into machine gun fire, barbed wire, and chaos. At Omaha Beach, the American forces were nearly driven back, but they held. Inch by inch, the Allies pushed through, suffering immense losses but refusing to retreat. By the end of the day, the beachheads were secured. France, long under Nazi occupation, had felt the first breath of liberation. Town by town, the Allies advanced through Normandy. The hedgerows became death traps. German snipers, tanks, and artillery made every field a battlefield. But Allied numbers, air power, and determination could not be stopped. Within weeks, they broke out of Normandy and began the liberation of Paris. As the Allies swept westward, resistance fighters rose from the shadows. French partisans, armed with stolen weapons and courage, sabotaged rail lines, ambushed German patrols, and guided Allied troops through unfamiliar terrain. On August 25, 1944, Paris was free. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags and crying tears of joy. Charles de Gaulle marched through the city, a symbol of France reborn. But there was no time to celebrate. The war was not over, not yet. To the east, the Red Army was on the move. The Soviet war machine, once on the brink of destruction, now thundered forward like an unstoppable tide. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, shattered German Army Group Center. In just weeks, Soviet forces recaptured vast territories, including Belarus, and advanced into Poland. The scale was staggering. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, and momentum fueled by vengeance and survival. For the Soviets, every village retaken was a symbol of resilience. Every German retreat was a step closer to justice. Yet, as the Allies closed in from both sides, Hitler refused to surrender. In desperation, he launched one final offensive in the West. In December 1944, under cover of heavy snow, German forces surged through the Ardennes forest in Belgium. The aim was to split the Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Caught off guard, American units fought fiercely in frozen forests and shattered towns. At Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne Division held the line. When the Germans demanded surrender, the American response was one word: nuts. Reinforcements soon arrived, the skies cleared, and the offensive was crushed. The last major German gamble had failed. The Allies pressed forward. Inside Germany, the walls were closing in. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg burned under relentless Allied bombing raids. The Reichstag, once a symbol of Hitler's grand vision, now loomed as a reminder of a crumbling dream. In the death camps, guard began to flee as Soviet and Allied forces drew near. What they left behind shocked even hardened soldiers. Rooms full of hair, gold teeth, and ash. Survivors emerged like ghosts, emaciated but alive. The truth of the Holocaust could no longer be hidden. As 1945 dawned, the final act began. In the East, the Soviets launched their assault on Berlin. It was not a surgical strike. It was a storm. Street by street, block by block, the Red Army clawed its way through the capital. Hitler, now a broken man hiding in his underground bunker, gave orders that made no sense. He trusted no one. His allies had abandoned him. His cities were ruins. His armies defeated. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler took his own life. His body was burned, his dream in ashes. Just days later, on May 7th, Germany unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In cities across the world, church bells rang and people flooded the streets in celebration. In London, New York, Moscow, and Paris, strangers embraced, danced, and wept. It was Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. But amid the joy was grief. Tens of millions had died. Families were broken. Nations were scarred. The world had changed forever. Yet even as Europe found peace, the war still raged in the Pacific. Japan, though losing ground, refused to surrender. The fighting grew fiercer, the resistance more suicidal. On the island of Iwo Jima, American Marines faced entrenched offenders who refused to yield. The cost was staggering, thousands of lives for just a few miles of land. But the image of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became an enduring symbol of sacrifice and resolve. Then came Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific and one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Kamikaze pilots rained death from above. Civilians, caught between two armies, suffered beyond measure. It was a glimpse of what an invasion of Japan would mean, devastation on an unimaginable scale. As the summer of 1945 approached, the Allies faced a terrible choice. A new weapon had been developed, one unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the deserts of New Mexico, a mushroom cloud rose into the sky. The atomic bomb was no longer theory. It was real, and it would soon change everything. The summer of 1945 was heavy with tension, as if the Earth itself knew that something irreversible was about to happen. In Europe, the guns had fallen silent, but in the Pacific, the battle still burned with ferocity that seemed endless. The Japanese Empire, though cornered, refused to bow. They had lost their fleets. Their air power had diminished. Their cities lay in ruins, but their spirit remained unbroken. For the United States and its allies, every inch of progress came at the price of blood. At the Potsdam Conference in July, the Allied leaders, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, met to determine how to reshape the post-war world. But the most pressing issue loomed over them like a specter: how to end the war with Japan. The Japanese code of Bushido, the warrior's way, preached death before surrender. And recent battles had confirmed that. On Iwo Jima, almost all Japanese defenders had fought to the death. On Okinawa, soldiers and civilians alike had leapt from cliffs rather than be taken alive. The cost of a mainland invasion was projected to be catastrophic. Millions of lives, both American and Japanese. But the Allies now held a weapon that could change the course of history with a single strike. It was born in secrecy, forged through fear and intellect, and named the Manhattan Project. Scientists from around the world, including those who had fled the Nazis, worked in hidden facilities to unlock the terrifying potential of nuclear fission. What they created was not just a bomb. It was the power of the sun trapped in a man-made device. And in the desert at Trinity, they had already tested it. The result was a blast brighter than the sky, a force that cracked mountains and made the ground tremble. The world would never be the same again. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the American B-29 bomber Enola Gay flew high over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Below, civilians went about their daily routines. Children walked to school, workers headed to factories, merchants opened their shops. Then, in a blinding flash, everything changed. A fireball erupted above the city, followed by a shockwave and a searing wind that flattened buildings and turned flesh to ash. In an instant, tens of thousands were killed. The city was engulfed in flames. And for those who survived the initial blast, radiation lingered, an invisible enemy that would claim many more in the days and years to come. But Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped, this time on the port city of Nagasaki. The destruction was equally horrifying. Hospitals, churches, homes, all disappeared in a single breath of fire. Emperor Hirohito, witnessing the ruin, understood the truth. His nation could not endure another strike. On August 15, 1945, he took to the radio for the first time in Japanese history. In a trembling voice, he told his people that Japan would accept the Allied terms. The war was over. Across the world, church bells rang once more. Soldiers dropped to their knees. In Times Square, a sailor kissed a stranger as a crowd erupted in jubilation. This was VJ Day, victory over Japan. It marked the true end of World War II. But even amid the celebrations, the shadow of what had been unleashed hung in the air. The atomic bomb had ended the war, but at a terrible cost. And now, humanity lived in a world where a single weapon could erase a city. In the aftermath, the world struggled to make sense of what had happened. Over 70 million people were dead, soldiers and civilians, men and women, the elderly and the unborn. Cities had been leveled, families destroyed, and the horrors uncovered in Nazi concentration camps defied understanding. When Allied soldiers liberated places like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau, they walked into nightmares. Emaciated prisoners stared blankly from behind barbed wire. Piles of corpses lay in sheds and ditches. Survivors spoke of gas chambers, medical experiments, forced labor, and cruelty beyond imagination. At Nuremberg, justice was demanded. In a series of historic trials, Nazi leaders were brought before an international court. For the first time in history, a global tribunal declared crimes against humanity and held individuals accountable. Men who had once commanded armies and designed policies of death now sat in wooden docks, listening as their deeds were read aloud. Some denied everything. Others showed no remorse. A few confessed. 12 were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. But the process was more than punishment. It was a reckoning. The world vowed never again. In Asia, too, there were trials. Japanese officials responsible for the rape of Nanking, biological experiments on civilians, and the brutal treatment of prisoners of war faced judgment. Emperor Hirohito, however, was spared prosecution, largely as a political decision to maintain stability in Japan. The country was occupied by American forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur. Under his guidance, Japan began the painful process of demilitarization and democratization. A new constitution was written, war was renounced, and slowly the nation rebuilt. Elsewhere, lines were being drawn for a new global order. The United Nations was formed in 1945, an attempt to replace the failed League of Nations with something stronger. It aimed to foster peace, cooperation, and dialogue between countries. But tensions simmered beneath the surface. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, once bound by necessity, began to fracture. In Eastern Europe, Stalin installed puppet governments, tightening his grip. In the West, democracies looked on with suspicion. From the ashes of one war, the seeds of another were planted. The Cold War. It would not be fought with tanks and trenches, but with spies, missiles, and ideology. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe. A nuclear arms race began, and fear became a constant companion. For the millions who had survived World War II, life would never return to what it was. Displaced persons wandered through ruined cities in search of family. Refugees crossed borders. Veterans tried to rebuild shattered lives. And yet, amid the sorrow, there was resilience. Towns were rebuilt. Nations healed. A new generation was born, shaped not by the battles they fought, but by the stories they inherited. World War II had changed everything: politics, borders, technology, morality. It had shown humanity's darkest depths and its greatest courage. In the skies over London, the snows of Stalingrad, the beaches of Normandy, and the jungles of the Pacific, ordinary people had faced extraordinary challenges. They had endured. They had fought. They had hoped. And now, as the smoke cleared, the question remained: would the world remember what it had learned? In the quiet years that followed the war, the scars of World War II remained etched across the face of the planet. Cities rebuilt from rubble carried whispers of the past in every brick. Forests of the wreckage of tanks and planes now overtaken by moss and silence. The people who had endured the unimaginable carried with them not just memories, but lessons, warnings etched in their bones. The war was over, yes, but its shadows stretched far into the decades that followed. The generation that fought in World War II came to be known as the greatest generation, and not because they sought glory or conquest, but because they endured a storm that could have torn the world apart. They were farmers who became soldiers, nurses who became lifelines, scientists who wrestled with questions of morality as they built weapons of unimaginable power, parents who sent their sons to fight in faraway lands, unsure if they'd ever return. It wasn't only the fighting that defined them. It was their resilience, their grit, their refusal to let the world slip into chaos without resistance. The geopolitical map of the world changed forever. Europe, once the epicenter of empire and ambition, now found itself divided, not just by geography, but by ideology. In the West, the United States helped rebuild through the Marshall Plan, infusing billions of dollars into shattered economies to prevent the spread of communism. In the East, the Soviet Union tightened its grip, turning liberated nations into satellites, reshaping their governments in its own image. Berlin, once a unified capital, was split down the middle, a city divided, a symbol of the Cold War to come. In Asia, the collapse of Japanese occupation sparked new conflicts. Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. In China, civil war resumed, eventually leading to the rise of the Communist Party under Mao Zedong. Vietnam, too, would soon become a flashpoint in the struggle between East and West. Independence movements swept across Africa and the Middle East, their momentum accelerated by the weakening of colonial powers. The war had shattered old hierarchies and exposed the hypocrisy of imperialism. In many corners of the globe, people began to demand the same freedom they had fought to preserve. At the same time, the world began to explore the ethics of war in ways it never had before. The sheer scale of civilian casualties, the mass bombings of cities, and the horrors of the Holocaust raised urgent questions. Philosophers, politicians, survivors, and theologians all asked, how could this have happened? What allowed ordinary people to become instruments of cruelty? And what responsibility does the world have to those who suffer? In classrooms, children began to study not just dates and battles, but the moral weight of history. In universities, the study of genocide, human rights, and international law grew. Museums and memorials were built, not just to remember the dead, but to teach the living. The Holocaust became a permanent warning etched into the conscience of humanity. Never again was not a slogan, it was a vow. Technological advancements made during the war would redefine the modern world. Radar, sonar, jet engines, antibiotics like penicillin, and nuclear energy all emerged from the pressure of wartime innovation. The same rockets that once carried bombs would, within decades, carry astronauts into space. The war had accelerated human advancement, but at a terrible price. In that contradiction lay one of the greatest dilemmas of the modern age: how to harness knowledge without repeating the mistakes of the past. In culture, World War II became a narrative that defined countless stories, films, books, and songs. From the black and white footage of D-Day landings to grainy images of concentration camp survivors, the visuals of war were seared into collective memory. Veterans returned home with medals, memories, and trauma, many of them silent about what they had seen. The wounds weren't always visible. The sounds of sirens, the crack of distant artillery, the loss of brothers in arms, these lived in the minds of soldiers long after the fighting ended. In homes around the world, war left empty chairs and folded flags, letters written on torn paper, faded photographs tucked into wallets, and medals in dusty drawers became family relics. For the children born during or after the war, the world felt like it had been rebuilt atop a graveyard. And in many ways it had. But there was also hope. From the ruins of total war came the idea that cooperation might prevent another catastrophe. The United Nations, formed in 1945, sought to bring nations together in dialogue. It wasn't perfect. Its structure reflected the politics of power, but it was a step. International laws were drafted, defining war crimes and crimes against humanity. A Declaration of Human Rights was proclaimed. The world had taken the first shaky steps toward collective responsibility. Still, peace was fragile. The atomic bomb had changed everything. Now, every major power raced to possess nuclear weapons. Mutually assured destruction became the strategy that kept the peace, a paradox of terror. But it worked. For decades, the world avoided another global war, even as smaller conflicts flared across the globe. The legacy of World War II lives on, not only in the monuments and cemeteries, but in the choices nations make every day. It taught the world about the dangers of unchecked power, the ease with which fear can be manipulated, and the strength that ordinary people can find when faced with impossible odds. It showed us that humanity is capable of both unspeakable evil and incredible courage. And perhaps, most importantly, it reminded us that history doesn't just happen. It is made by those who choose to stand, to speak, to fight, and to remember. Now, as we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, the war feels distant in years, but close in impact. Its echoes are everywhere, in our politics, our borders, our technology, and our stories. It was a war that reshaped the world, not just with force, but with fire, fear, and ultimately, the will to survive. For every name etched into marble, for every cry heard across the continents, and for every light that was extinguished too soon, this story must continue to be told, not just as a remembrance of what was, but as a warning of what could be. Because the true lesson of World War II is not in the battles won or the flags raised. It is in the human cost, and in the hope that such a war will never be needed again. When the final shots were fired and the ashes of war settled, the world stood still, scarred, changed, but still standing. Cities were rebuilt, nations redefined, and humanity made a quiet promise: never again. But promises like peace are fragile. World War II was more than a conflict. It was a mirror held up to mankind, revealing both our capacity for destruction and our resilience to endure. From the horrors of the Holocaust to the bravery of soldiers and civilians alike, every chapter told us something vital: that silence enables evil, that unity is our strength, and that remembering is our responsibility. Now, the last living witnesses grow fewer. The photographs fade. The voices soften. But the story must not be forgotten. Scroll if this journey moved you, inspired you, or open your eyes to the truths we must protect. Don't just leave it here. Backhand index pointing right, like, share, and comment with your thoughts. Television, and subscribe to History Vault for more deep dive documentaries that awaken the past. Because understanding World War II isn't just about remembering the past. It's about safeguarding the future.